The cheap paper of the eviction notice felt rough and final under Helen's trembling fingers, its sharp corners dug into her palm as she read the words for the 10th time. Eviction. 48 hours. The stark, black letters seemed to mock her, each one a nail in the coffin of the life she had tried so desperately to hold together for the last 6 months. A cold knot of dread tightened in her stomach, a familiar feeling since the accident that took her husband. The silence in the small rented apartment was heavy, broken only by the low, mournful hum of the old refrigerator and the distant wail of a city siren that seemed to cry out for her. She closed her eyes, and the image of her husband's smiling face, his hands calloused from construction work, flashed in her mind. Then it was replaced by the crushing memory of sterile hospital hallways, the scent of antiseptic, and the weight of medical debts that had devoured their meager savings. She felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. She was utterly and completely alone. She walked on numb feet to the kitchen table, where her entire life was laid out in a small, pathetic pile. $3,000. Worn $20 bills and a handful of 10s and 5s, the sum total of her existence as a widowed seamstress. She counted it again, her fingers fumbling. As if the number might magically change, 3,000, not a penny more. It was the money she had saved to start a small tailoring business from home, a dream that now felt like a cruel joke. Her stomach ached with a hollow emptiness that had nothing to do with the fact she hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. It was the gnawing hunger of pure fear. This money was supposed to be a beginning, a future for her and her son. Now it was a stopwatch, counting down the last seconds of their stability before they were thrown onto the unforgiving streets. The fabric swatches on her sewing table seemed to stare at her, their vibrant colors a stark contrast to the gray despair that had seeped into her bones. From the corner of her eye she saw her son, Lucas, 10 years old, asleep on the worn-out couch, his face serene in the dim light filtering through the grimy window. His small chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, blissfully unaware of the precipice on which their lives teetered. A wave of protective love, so fierce it was physically painful, washed over Helen. She would starve before he missed a meal. She would sleep in a cardboard box if it meant he had a blanket. But the shame burned in her gut. She had failed him. Her husband had trusted her to care for their boy, and in 48 hours, she would have no roof to put over his head. Silent tears she could no longer hold back began to stream down her face, hot trails of failure on her cold skin. She tiptoed closer, pulling the thin blanket up to his chin, her hand shaking as she brushed a stray lock of hair from his forehead. He was all she had left. The weight of it all pressed down on her, a physical force that made her shoulders ache and her breathing shallow. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of panic. She walked to the window and stared down at the city lights, a glittering, indifferent galaxy that stretched out to the horizon. Each light was a home, a family, a life that wasn't about to shatter into a million pieces. The sounds of traffic, of laughter from a bar down the street, felt like they were from another world, a world she was no longer a part of. She felt an invisible wall between herself and everyone else, a cold glass pane of poverty and grief. The world would keep spinning, cars would keep driving, people would keep laughing, and in 2 days, she and her son would simply vanish, swallowed by the city's vast, dark anonymity. She sank to the floor, the cold linoleum seeping through her thin pants, and finally let out a sob. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a weak, breathless sound, the sound of a spirit breaking. The fight had drained out of her, replaced by a terrifying, empty resignation. There were no family members left to call, no friends who could afford to take in a mother and her child indefinitely. There was just the eviction notice on the table, the $3,000 that felt more like an insult than a lifeline, and the sleeping boy who deserved so much more than this. She wrapped her arms around her knees, a grown woman curled into a ball in the dark, and felt the last flicker of hope die within her. The world had become a dark, silent room with no doors and no windows. There was no way out. It was in the deepest pit of the night, when the city's pulse had slowed to a faint murmur, that a desperate new idea took hold. Helen's eyes burned from staring at her phone's small screen, the blue light a harsh spotlight on her desperation. She scrolled through endless job listings, each requiring qualifications she didn't have or offering wages that wouldn't cover a week's worth of food. The silence of the apartment felt suffocating, punctuated only by the soft sighs from Lucas sleeping on the couch. Every click of the mouse, every tap on the screen, sounded like a countdown to their homelessness. A headache throbbed behind her eyes, born of hunger and exhaustion. She felt herself shrinking, becoming smaller and more invisible with each passing second, a ghost haunting her own life. The world was a feast, and she was starving outside the window, her face pressed against the cold, unforgiving glass. The last of her tears had dried, leaving her feeling hollowed out, a brittle shell of a person. Her fingers, numb and clumsy, strayed from the mainstream job sites into the darker corners of the internet. It was a place of garish pop-up ads and misspelled headlines, a digital flea market of broken dreams and last chances, and there, tucked between ads for miracle cures and questionable loans, she saw it. The letters seemed to flicker, to call out to her from the chaotic screen. For sale, self-contained basement unit, old downtown building, private, own your own space, no more rent. The words were a siren song to her shipwrecked soul. Then she saw the price, a number that made her heart stop and then restart with a painful, violent jolt. $3,000. Exactly. It felt like fate, a cruel and twisted sign from a universe that had taken everything else. A basement. It sounded grim, a space buried beneath the earth, but it also sounded like a foundation, a floor that no one could pull out from under her feet. It was a choice between the street and the earth, and she chose the earth. A frantic, terrifying debate raged in her mind. Her rational self screamed that it was a scam, a trap set for the desperate, a fool's bargain. Buying a property site unseen from a shady website was madness. She could be throwing away the last safety net she had for her and her son, but the mother in her, the cornered animal willing to do anything to protect her young, saw it differently. It was a roof, a permanent one. It wasn't a handout or a temporary fix. It was a single, decisive action that could save them. The thought of owning something, anything, after losing so much was intoxicating. Her hand hovered over the button to transfer the money, her entire body trembling. She imagined Lucas, safe and warm, even if it was in a tiny, windowless room. The image was all that mattered. She closed her eyes, the sound of her own ragged breathing loud in her ears, and clicked. The transfer was instantaneous. A cold wave of nausea washed over her as she saw her savings account balance drop to zero. The finality of the act was like a physical blow. $3,000, her husband's life insurance, her sewing business dreams, all of it was gone. Traded for a digital receipt and a cryptic email with an address and a key code. For a moment, the panic was so overwhelming she thought she might be sick. A suffocating tightness gripped her chest. What had she done? She had gambled their entire future on a whisper of hope from a con artist's website, but then she forced the feeling down, burying it under a layer of fragile, manufactured optimism. It had to work. There was no other option. She stood up, her joints cracking, and began to move with a strange, new purpose. The decision was made. There was no going back, only forward, into the unknown. She felt a bizarre sense of liberation mixed with the terror. She had taken control, for better or worse. Their fate was no longer in the hands of a landlord, but in her own. The thought was both terrifying and empowering. Waking Lucas was the hardest part. She gently shook his shoulder, her voice a strained whisper, trying to frame their departure as an adventure. "We're moving, sweetheart, to our very own place." His sleepy, trusting eyes looked up at her, and a fresh wave of guilt stabbed at her heart. He didn't question it, simply nodding as he rubbed the sleep from his eyes. Together they packed. It didn't take long. Their life fit into 2 large suitcases and a handful of cardboard boxes. The sound of packing tape being ripped from the roll was unnervingly loud in the quiet apartment. Each object she packed, a framed photo of her husband, Lucas's worn teddy bear, her heavy sewing machine, felt like a piece of her past she was sealing away. The vibrant fabric swatches she had once cherished now seemed like relics from another person's life, a life full of dreams that had died. She worked mechanically, her movements jerky, her mind a blank canvas of dread and forced hope. Leaving the apartment for the last time felt surreal. Helen turned the key in the lock, the metallic click echoing in the empty hallway like a final gunshot. The door shut on the life they had known, on the ghost of her husband's laughter and the scent of their shared meals. She didn't look back. She couldn't. Lucas held her hand, his small fingers wrapped tightly around hers, his own small suitcase bumping against his leg. He looked up at her, his expression a mixture of confusion and excitement, and she forced a smile that felt like it might crack her face. She was his entire world, his anchor in this sudden storm, and she had to be strong. The weight of his trust was heavier than all their luggage combined. As they walked out of the building and into the cold morning air, she felt an overwhelming sense of dislocation, as if they were astronauts stepping out of their ship into a new, alien atmosphere, with no map and no guarantee of survival. The bus ride across town was a blur of unfamiliar streets and faces. Helen held their bags tightly on her lap, the worn straps digging into her palms. The city rushed by the window, a smear of grey buildings and hurried people. Each passing car, each lit window of a warm-looking home, was a reminder of the normal life they had just been ejected from. The jarring sounds of the city, the screech of bus brakes, the distant scream of a siren, the cacophony of 1,000 conversations, were a stark contrast to the thick silence that had enveloped her and Lucas. She tried to picture their new home, painting it in her mind as a cozy, subterranean nest, a place they could make their own. She whispered stories to Lucas about how they would decorate it, how it would be their secret clubhouse, building a fantasy to shield him, and perhaps herself, from the terrifying reality of their gamble. Her own heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of, what if, what if, what if? The address led them to a part of downtown that tourists and commerce had long forgotten. The building was a hulking behemoth of stained brick and grimy stone, its upper windows boarded up or broken, like vacant eyes staring into nothing. It loomed over the narrow street, casting a long, oppressive shadow that seemed to drain the color from the day. The air here was thicker, heavy with the smell of exhaust fumes and damp rot. Helen's forced optimism began to crumble at the edges. This was not a place of new beginnings, it was a place of endings. It felt like a monument to neglect. Lucas squeezed her hand tighter, his small body pressing against her leg. "It's big," he whispered, his voice full of an awe that was curdling into fear. Helen could feel his anxiety, and it mirrored her own. Her stomach twisted into a cold, hard knot. This was it. This was the place her last $3,000 had bought them. They found the entrance in a narrow, dark alleyway that reeked of stale garbage and stagnant water. A single, rusted metal door was set low into the building's stone foundation, half hidden in the shadows. It looked less like an entrance to a home, and more like the gateway to a sewer or a forgotten tomb. Helen's hands trembled as she fumbled with the old iron key that had been left for them in a magnetic lockbox. It was cold and heavy in her hand. The lock was stiff with rust, and she had to put her shoulder into it, grunting with effort as she turned the key. The sound of the metal scraping and groaning was a protest, as if the building itself was refusing them entry. Finally, with a loud, jarring clunk, the lock gave way. She took a deep, shaky breath, her heart pounding in her ears. She pushed the heavy door inward. For a single, eternal second, she held on to the last shred of hope, praying that what lay beyond was not as bad as her fear was telling her it would be. The moment the door creaked open, the hope didn't just fade, it was violently extinguished, snuffed out by a wave of smell so potent it made her gag. It was the thick, putrid stench of decades of mold, of damp, decaying earth, and of stagnant water. It was a smell of absolute neglect, of a place that had been sealed and forgotten by the sun. A cold, clammy draught slithered out from the darkness, wrapping around her ankles and crawling up her legs, a physical manifestation of the building's chill. It was the air of a crypt. Helen's heart, which had been pounding with a mix of fear and anticipation, now felt as if it had dropped into a pool of ice water in her stomach. Lucas coughed beside her, pulling the collar of his jacket up over his nose. "Mommy, it smells bad," he whimpered, his voice small and lost in the oppressive atmosphere. The fragile bubble of hope she had carefully constructed around them had popped, leaving only the foul reality. As her eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom, the full horror of her mistake revealed itself. The space was a cramped, dark cubicle, illuminated by a single, dark, bare bulb hanging precariously from a frayed wire, casting long, dancing shadows that made the room feel alive and menacing. The walls were not brick, but rough, uneven stone, weeping with moisture. Dark, Ugly water stains snaked down from the ceiling in multiple places, like black tears shed by the building itself. The floor was a patchwork of cracked concrete and dark, warped wooden planks, some of which looked soft and rotten. There were no windows, not even a small ventilation slit. It was a box, a cold, wet, unhealthy box, far smaller and more wretched than she could have ever imagined. The feeling was not just disappointment, it was a profound sense of being buried alive. This wasn't a home. It was a prison cell she had paid to enter. Lucas let go of her hand and took a tentative step inside. His foot made a soft, squelching sound. "Mommy, the floor is wet," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the tomb-like silence. He pointed to a corner where a steady drip, drip, drip of water landed in a dark puddle, the sound a constant, maddening rhythm in the gloom. Seeing the look on his face, the confusion, the dawning disappointment, the trust in her starting to waver, was like a physical blow. The shame that washed over Helen was scalding. She had done this. She had brought her child, her precious boy, to this squalid, unhealthy hole. The fantasies of a secret clubhouse and a cozy nest evaporated, replaced by the grotesque reality of their new home. She had not saved him from the street. She had moved them into the gutter. The air was so thick and heavy it felt hard to breathe, and she could already feel the dampness seeping into her clothes, into her very bones. She dropped her suitcase with a dull thud. Her legs felt weak, her body heavy with the crushing weight of her failure. She walked the perimeter of the room. It took 6 paces one way and 4 the other. She could nearly touch both walls if she stretched out her arms. It was a cage. As she ran her hand along a stone wall, her fingers came away slick with a cold, slimy film. A noise, a frantic, dry, scuttling sound from a dark corner, made her freeze. A jolt of pure terror shot through her. Rats. Of course there were rats. She felt her skin crawl. 1,000 imaginary legs skittering across her body. The drip, drip, drip of the water was the only other sound. A relentless torture that promised no sleep, no peace. The feeling of regret was so intense, it was a physical pain, a burning acid rising from her stomach to her throat. She had been so stupid, so blinded by desperation. The false hope she had clung to for the past 12 hours was gone, and the void it left behind was colder and darker than the despair she had felt in their old apartment. At least there had been memories of laughter and sunlight. Here, there was only decay. There was no going back. The money was gone. The old apartment locked. This was it. This was their life now. The realization hit her with the force of a physical impact, knocking the air from her lungs and buckling her knees. She wanted to scream, to smash her fists against the weeping stone walls, to rage at the injustice of it all. But she was too tired. The fight, the last of it, had finally drained out of her. She looked at Lucas, his small form a silhouette in the dim yellow light, and felt a despair so absolute it was a physical weight, pressing her down, into the cold, wet floor. Helen didn't even notice as she slid down the damp, slimy wall, her clothes soaking up the filth. She didn't care. She wrapped her arms around her knees, mirroring the broken posture she'd held just the night before, but this time it was different. That was the despair of uncertainty. This was the despair of finality. She had played her last card, and she had lost everything. The basement seemed to shrink around her, the air growing thicker, the shadows deeper. The constant dripping of water was like the ticking of a clock, counting down not to eviction, but to a slow, miserable decline in this subterranean hell. A sob escaped her, a ragged, choked sound, swallowed by the oppressive silence of the room. She had reached the bottom, only to discover a new, deeper bottom beneath it. Here, in the cold, damp dark, surrounded by rot and the stench of failure, Helen knew she was truly, utterly, and completely trapped. Helen sat there, a statue carved from grief, as the minutes bled into an hour. The rhythmic drip, drip, drip of water was a form of torture, each drop a tiny hammer against her sanity. She felt Lucas's small hand on her arm, a tentative touch in the vast darkness of her despair. She couldn't bring herself to look at him, to see the reflection of her own failure in his innocent eyes. Her body was heavy, anchored to the cold, wet floor by the immense weight of her mistake. The air was thick and tasted of mildew and defeat. A chilling thought surfaced from the depths of her mind. This is where they would die. Not quickly, but slowly, from sickness brought on by the damp, from the cold that was already seeping deep into her bones. The single bare bulb flickered overhead, casting the room in a sickly yellow light. Then near darkness, a stuttering heartbeat for a place that had long been dead. She felt a profound emptiness, a void where hope and fight and even anger used to be. It was just gone, leaving only a hollow ache. Lucas, however, was 10. He was a child, and the resilience of a child is a strange and powerful force. The oppressive gloom of the basement was a monster, but he was determined not to let it swallow him whole. He wanted to see his mother smile again, to chase the terrifying stillness from her eyes. He dug into his small backpack, his fingers searching for the one piece of his old life he had insisted on bringing. His hand closed around cool, familiar metal. It was his favorite toy, a small die-cast car, its red paint chipped from countless imaginary races on their old apartment's wooden floors. It was a relic from a sunnier, happier world, a world with a father and a warm bed. He pulled it out, its weight in his small palm a comfort. He looked at his mother's slumped form, her face hidden by her arms, and a fierce resolve took root in his young heart. He had to do something. He couldn't just sit here in the sad, dripping dark. He had to make a noise, any noise, to prove they were still alive. He knelt on the damp floor, uncaring of the cold that seeped through the knees of his jeans. He placed the toy car on a patch of cracked concrete. The rough surface was nothing like the smooth floors he was used to. He gave the car a little push. It didn't roll smoothly. It scraped and skittered, the sound of metal on stone grating and loud in the tomb-like silence. For a moment, it was a welcome distraction, a sound that wasn't the maddening drip of water. It was a sound he was making, a small act of defiance against the despair that had consumed his mother. He pushed it again, harder this time, aiming for the far wall. The car shot forward, a tiny red blur in the dim light. He imagined the roar of an engine, the cheers of a crowd, trying to build a new world for himself within these four weeping walls. He watched it travel, a miniature missile of hope, until it left the concrete patch and rolled onto the section of the floor made of old, dark wooden planks. The sound changed instantly. The scraping stopped, replaced by a soft rumbling as the wheels rolled over the wood. The car was nearing the far corner, losing momentum. It finally came to a stop, not with a gentle bump against the stone wall, but with a distinct and unexpected sound. Thunk. It wasn't a solid sound, it was hollow, resonant. It echoed for a split second in the quiet room, a deep, wooden note that was completely different from any other sound they had heard in this place. The dripping continued, but for Lucas it was as if all other noise had ceased. The hollow thunk hung in the air, a question mark. He crawled over to the corner, his curiosity piqued. He picked up his car and then, using his knuckles, he tapped the plank the car had hit. Thunk, thunk, thunk. It was unmistakable. He tapped the board next to it. Thud, thud. A solid, dull sound. He went back to the first one. Thunk. It was like a drum, a secret drum. "Mom," he whispered, his voice small but clear. Helen didn't move. She was lost, adrift on an ocean of regret. "Mom," he said again, a little louder this time, his voice trembling slightly. "Go listen." He tapped the board again, a rhythmic thunk, thunk, thunk. The sound finally pierced the thick fog of Helen's misery. It was a different sound, a break in the monotonous torture of the dripping water. She slowly lifted her head, her neck stiff, her eyes red and swollen. She saw Lucas crouched in the corner, his small face etched with a strange mix of excitement and concentration. He looked back at her, his eyes wide, and gestured for her to come closer. "It sounds different," he said, his voice now filled with a sense of urgent discovery. "This one, it's empty." The word empty resonated with her. She was empty. Her wallet was empty. Her future was empty. But this was a different kind of empty. It was a hidden kind. A tiny spark of curiosity, the first emotion other than despair she had felt in hours, flickered to life within her. She pushed herself up, her limbs aching with a cold stiffness. She felt ancient, as if the dampness had aged her decades in a single afternoon. She crawled on her hands and knees over to where Lucas was, the rough concrete and splintered wood scraping her palms. She felt the chill of the floor through her thin pants. but her focus was now on that single plank of wood. "Show me," she whispered, her voice hoarse from crying and disuse. Lucas beamed, a flicker of his old self returning. He tapped the board again, demonstrating his discovery. Helen pressed her ear to the wood, closing her eyes. He was right. While the other boards felt dead and solid, this one had a faint vibration, a hollowness that suggested a space beneath. Her heart, which had been a dead weight in her chest, gave a faint, tentative flutter. She ran her fingers along the edges of the board. The surrounding planks were fused together with age and grime, but this one had a thin, almost invisible seam around it. It had been cut. It was a panel, designed to be removed. Someone had hidden something here. The thought was electric, a jolt that cleared some of the fog from her brain. Hope was too strong a word for what she felt, but it was something. It was a mystery, a distraction, a single loose thread in the suffocating blanket of her fate. She tried to pry it up with her fingernails, but they were short and brittle, and the wood wouldn't budge. It was fitted too tightly. "I need something," she muttered, her mind racing, "something thin and strong." Her eyes scanned the miserable room, the scattered boxes, the pathetic pile of their belongings, and then she saw it. Lying on top of her fabrics, glinting in the dim light, were her sewing scissors. The scissors were heavy and professional, made of solid steel. They were a symbol of her failed dream, the tool she was meant to use to build their future. Now, they would be used to dig into the past. She grabbed them, the cold metal a familiar weight in her hand. She knelt back down, her breath held tight in her chest. She carefully wedged the sharp tip of the scissors into the thin seam at the edge of the board. She was terrified of breaking them. They were one of the most valuable things she still owned, but the pull of the mystery was stronger. She began to lever the scissors back and forth, using all the strength in her wrist. The wood creaked in protest. A fine shower of dust and splinters fell from the crack. Lucas watched, his eyes wide, his small hands clenched into fists. For a moment, Helen thought the old wood would simply break apart, or the tip of her scissors would snap. With a final, desperate push, she put her weight into it. There was a loud groan of splintering wood, followed by a sharp crack. The end of the plank lifted by an inch. A puff of air escaped from the opening, and with it, a new smell. It wasn't the smell of mold and rot that permeated the rest of the basement. This was a dry, dusty scent, the smell of old paper, of confined space, of time itself. It was the smell of a secret. Her heart was now hammering against her ribs, a frantic, wild rhythm that drowned out the dripping water. She worked her fingers into the gap she had created, the splintered wood digging into her skin. She pulled. The board resisted, scraping against its confines, then suddenly came loose in her hands. She tossed it aside and stared down into the darkness. It was a small, perfectly square compartment, about 2 feet deep, carved out of the earth and lined with crumbling brick. It was a void, a dark mouth in the floor. She reached her hand into the cold, dark space, her fingers brushing against a thick layer of dust and cobwebs. Her heart pounded with a mix of fear and anticipation. What if it was just an old pipe? What if it was filled with spiders or worse? Then her fingertips brushed against something else. It was hard, cold, and rough. Metal. It was rectangular and heavy. Her fingers fumbled to find a grip on its surface. It was a box. It was larger than a shoebox, but not by much, and it was surprisingly heavy. Grunting with the effort, she hooked her fingers under its edge and began to pull. It was wedged in tightly. She had to shift her position, bracing her feet as she heaved it upwards. The sound of rusted metal scraping against brick was loud and jarring. Finally, it came free. She lifted it out of the compartment and placed it on the floor between her and Lucas. It was a small, unassuming chest, its surface covered in a thick layer of orange rust. The box was locked with a simple, corroded metal clasp. There was no key. For a heart-stopping moment, Helen thought their discovery would end there, thwarted by a simple lock. The frustration was a physical taste in her mouth. But she had come this far. She would not be stopped. She took her sewing scissors again, a tool of creation now repurposed for destruction. She wedged the tip under the rusted hasp and pushed. The metal groaned. She pushed harder, her knuckles white, her arm trembling with the strain. Lucas leaned in, his breathing shallow and quick. With a final, sharp snap, The rusted metal of the clasp broke apart. It was done. The lid was free. She paused, her hand hovering over the box, a sudden wave of apprehension washing over her. What was she about to unleash? This was not just a box. It was a story, a secret that someone had gone to great lengths to bury. Taking a deep, shaky breath, she lifted the lid. The hinges creaked, two mournful notes that seemed to echo through the decades. The first thing she saw was dark fabric, old faded velvet covering the contents. Her heart sank. Was it just old rags? But there were lumps beneath the fabric, distinct shapes. With a trembling finger, she lifted a corner of the velvet. A soft, warm gleam of light caught her eye, a flicker of gold that seemed impossibly bright in the dim, squalid basement. It wasn't a trick of the light. She pulled the velvet away, and she and Lucas both gasped in unison. The box was filled with jewelry, dozens of necklaces, their gold chains intertwined like sleeping serpents, rings set with diamonds that captured the dim light of the single bulb and shattered it into 100 tiny, brilliant rainbows, heavy brooches, glittering with emeralds and sapphires. It was a pirate's treasure, a king's ransom, lying in a rusty box in a forgotten hellhole. The sheer, staggering value of it was incomprehensible. It was more money than she had ever seen, more than she could even imagine. It was a way out. It was food, and a safe home, and an education for Lucas. It was a future. But as she stared at the glittering hoard, she didn't feel the rush of joy she expected. Instead, a profound and unsettling coldness settled over her. This wasn't just wealth. It felt sad. The jewels seemed to carry a weight, a history. She ran her fingers over a string of pearls, their surface smooth and cool. Who had worn these? Whose neck had this graced at a party or a dinner? Who had cherished this diamond ring? This wasn't just treasure. It was the collected pieces of a life, or many lives. The weight of that realization pressed down on her, heavier than any gold. This fortune felt like a ghost, and its presence was a cold draft in the room. Beneath the first layer of jewelry, she found more. Tightly wrapped bundles of old cloth contained more rings, earrings, and delicate bracelets, and underneath those, something else. Wads of paper currency, bound with brittle string. She picked up a stack. They weren't modern bills. They were old, yellowed American dollars, the paper soft and fragile to the touch. The faces on them were unfamiliar, the design antiquated. There were thousands upon thousands of dollars. It was a fortune on top of a fortune. She stared at it, her mind reeling. Who gathers a treasure like this, cash and gold and diamonds, and buries it under the floor of a miserable basement? Not a savvy investor, not a happy person. This was the work of someone who was running, someone who was hiding, someone who feared that everything they had could be taken away in an instant. This was the desperate act of a refugee. At the very bottom of the box, lying flat against the rusted metal, were two final items. The first was a small book, bound in dark, cracked leather. Its pages were yellowed and filled with dense, spidery handwriting. A diary. The second was a thin sheaf of letters, tied together with a faded silk ribbon. She picked up one of the letters, her fingers trembling. The paper was almost translucent with age. She unfolded it carefully, her heart pounding. The script was elegant, but the language was utterly foreign to her. It was sharp and angular, German. She couldn't read a single word, but the emotion in the frantic, slanting script was universal. It spoke of urgency, of fear, of desperation. The diary was the same, page after page of incomprehensible German words, a silent history locked away from her. The treasure was a question, but these papers, she knew instinctively, were the answer. She looked from the glittering jewels to the yellow diary in her hands. She thought of the family who had owned these things. She imagined them packing this box in a hurry, in the dead of night, their hands shaking just as hers were now. They had placed each precious item inside, not as wealth, but as a lifeline, a last hope for a new start. And then they had hidden it here, in this dark, wretched place, and they had never come back for it. Why? What had happened to them? The treasure was no longer a miracle. It was an epitaph. It was a tombstone for a family she had never known, whose story was now resting in her lap. The weight of it was unbearable. The joy of finding a fortune was completely eclipsed by the cold, certain knowledge that she had stumbled upon a great and terrible tragedy. She was not the inheritor of a treasure. She was the custodian of a ghost story. The full weight of the discovery finally broke her. Tears began to stream down her face, but they were not tears of joy or relief. They were tears of a profound, soul-deep sorrow. She cried for the faceless, nameless family who had lost everything. She cried for the fear they must have felt, a fear that was now a palpable presence in the room. She cried because this treasure, this key to her own salvation, felt tainted by their loss. Lucas, seeing her tears, misunderstood. He thought she was happy. He put a small hand on her shoulder. "We're rich, Mum," he whispered, his voice full of wonder. But Helen just shook her head, unable to speak through the sobs that racked her body. She clutched the old leather diary to her chest, feeling the ghosts of the Hartman family pressing in on her from all sides. The cold, damp basement no longer felt empty. It felt crowded. Crowded with the echoes of a stolen past and the heavy, silent weight of an unresolved tragedy. The phone screen cast a ghostly blue light on Helen's face, its battery indicator glowing a menacing red, 5%. She had to be fast. The damp air of the basement felt even colder as she hunched over the rusty box, the diary open on her lap. Her hands, stained with rust and grime, trembled as she aimed her phone's camera at the first page of spidery German script. The translation app Word, its digital eye struggling to focus in the dim light. A robotic, female voice, devoid of all emotion, began to read the translated text aloud, the sterile words a shocking contrast to the ancient paper and the weight of the history it held. "My name is Samuel Hartman," the phone droned, "and if you are reading this, then God has abandoned us." Helen's heart constricted. The sound of the dripping water faded away, replaced by the pounding in her ears. She wasn't just reading a diary. She was listening to a ghost, its voice channeled through the cold circuits of her phone, and a deep, primal fear began to uncoil in the pit of her stomach, cold and heavy as a serpent. This was more than a story. The synthetic voice continued its monotone recitation, each word a hammer blow against the silence. Date, October 1942. "We have been in this city for 6 weeks. The air does not smell of freedom. It smells of industry and indifference." Helen leaned closer, her own breath held tight in her chest. The diary spoke of a life left behind in Berlin, a respected tailor shop, a warm apartment filled with the smell of Rebecca's baking, the laughter of 2 small children, Daniel and Lena. Samuel wrote of the night it was all taken, the shattering glass, the shouted slurs, the terror in his children's eyes. He wrote of their escape with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the small, heavy box containing the salvaged remnants of their lives, Rebecca's family heirlooms, cash from the sale of their assets. A tiny fortune they prayed would be enough to buy them a new beginning. Helen felt a tear slide down her own cheek, a pang of shared loss that bridged the 80 years between them. She was a seamstress. He was a tailor. The kinship felt eerie, intimate. The online translator struggled with the faded ink, the voice sputtering fragments of the Hartman's agony. The crossing was a nightmare, a vessel for ghosts, sick with fear and seawater. Samuel's words painted a vivid, horrifying picture of their journey. He described hiding in the dark, fetid hold of a cargo ship, the constant fear of discovery, the cries of his daughter Lena, who was too young to understand the need for silence. He wrote of the hope that had kept them alive, the dream of America, a place where their name would not be a death sentence, where his children could grow up without looking over their shoulders. Helen could almost feel the cold dampness of the ship's hold, smell the salt and the fear, hear the hushed whispers of the family huddled in the dark. The musty air of the basement seemed to merge with the ghostly atmosphere of the ship, and she felt a wave of dizziness, her own hunger and exhaustion blurring the lines between her reality and the tragedy unfolding in her hands. She was no longer in a basement. She was a witness. The diary entries shifted in tone upon their arrival in New York. A fragile, desperate hope bloomed on the yellowed pages. "We have found a room," the phone read. "It is small, but it is safe for now. Rebecca tries to make it a home, but our hearts are full of shadows." Samuel described his search for help, his visits to community centers and aid societies, the endless closed doors and suspicious glances. He wrote of the crushing weight of being an outsider, invisible and unheard, his skills as a master tailor meaning nothing in this new, bewildering world. He was terrified their money would run out before he could secure their future. Helen knew that feeling intimately. The cold dread of dwindling funds, the shame of not being able to provide, the terror of being utterly dependent on the kindness or cruelty of strangers. The words on the page were his, but the emotions were hers, a perfect, terrible reflection of her own despair. The 80-year gap between them collapsed into a single, shared moment of profound vulnerability and fear. Then, a new name appeared in the diary, a name that made the robotic voice sound almost ominous. Today, we met a man, an important man. His name is Sterling. Helen's fingers tightened on the diary. The name felt significant, a key turning in a lock. Samuel described him as a powerful lawyer, a man with connections who moved with an air of authority and confidence that seemed like a lifeline. He wrote, "Mr. Sterling has promised us everything: new passports, new identities, a safe, legal life in America. He says he understands our plight and wants to help." The diary entry was filled with a desperate, soaring relief. Samuel wrote of the lawyer's sharp suit, his smooth words, and the way he seemed to command respect wherever he went. He was their savior, their angel in the cold, indifferent city. Helen felt a knot of dread tighten in her gut. She could feel the shape of the story turning, a dark premonition of the betrayal she knew was coming. It was the same false hope she herself had clung to just hours before. The next entry was dated 2 days later. It was short, the handwriting more frantic. "We have given him the box," the phone read, its monotone voice making the words even more chilling. All of it. The jewels, the cash. Mr. Sterling said it was necessary to secure the documents and prove our financial stability. He told us to wait here, in the basement room of a building he owns, where no one would find us. He said he would return in 48 hours with our new lives. A basement. This basement. A cold shock, sharp and electric, shot through Helen. This was not just a random hiding place. This was the scene of the crime. She looked around the weeping stone walls, at the dripping puddle in the corner. The Hartmans had been here. They had waited in this very room, their hearts filled with the same desperate hope she had felt. They had trusted him completely, handing over their entire world in a rusty metal box, believing it was the price of their salvation. The weight of the story was becoming a physical presence in the room, suffocating her. The entry for the following day was a single, devastating line. The ink was smudged, as if written with a shaking hand. He did not come. The simple words hung in the air, heavy and final. The silence that followed was more profound than any sound. Helen didn't need the translator for the next part. The raw emotion in the script was a universal language. The neat, disciplined handwriting had dissolved into a desperate, almost illegible scrawl. "The food is gone. The children are crying. He does not answer our messages. Rebecca weeps in the corner. She says she knew it. She saw the greed in his eyes, a coldness. Oh God, what have I done? I have led my family into a trap. We are buried alive." Helen felt a sob rise in her throat, thick and painful. She saw the image of Rebecca crying in the corner and glanced at the corner where she herself had collapsed in despair just hours before. The horrifying parallel, the shared geography of grief, made her feel as if she was losing her mind. The final pages of the diary were nightmarish. The name Sterling was repeated over and over, no longer a savior but a curse. Samuel pieced together the truth with dawning horror. The lawyer owned the building. He had brought them here to this isolated basement, a place where their disappearance would go unnoticed. He had not only stolen their fortune, but Samuel had a growing, sickening certainty that Sterling was the one who had reported them to the authorities. It was the perfect crime. He would let the government dispose of the inconvenient witnesses while he kept their treasure, hiding it here in the very room where they had last tasted hope. Planning to retrieve it once they were gone, Helen felt physically ill, a wave of nausea rolling through her. The name Sterling was seared into her brain. The man was not just a thief, he was a monster, a predator who fed on the desperation of the helpless. The jewels in the box no longer glittered. They seemed to soak up the light, dark and heavy with the weight of this sin. The very last entry was almost impossible to read. The script was a frantic, slanted mess, written in the final moments of their freedom. "They are at the door, I hear them. Official voices, American voices. It is over. Sterling has murdered us. He has murdered my children. Rebecca, my love, I am so sorry. Lena, Daniel, forgive your foolish father. If anyone ever finds this, know what he did. May his name be cursed. May his children's children reap the poison he has sown. The page was stained with a single, faint watermark, a ghost of a tear shed 80 years ago. As the translator's voice fell silent, Helen heard the sounds Samuel had described, not from the past, but from the present. She could hear the faint echo of official voices, see the terror in his children's eyes. The diary wasn't just paper and ink. It was a testament, a final scream for justice from the grave. She was no longer a finder of treasure. She was the keeper of a terrible, violent secret, and its weight was crushing her. She hugged the diary to her chest, her body racked with silent sobs. The gold and diamonds in the box felt unclean, like stolen artifacts from a desecrated tomb. This wasn't a lottery ticket. It wasn't a miracle. It was evidence. It was the story of a family destroyed by greed, and she was now inextricably part of it. The name Sterling echoed in her mind, a venomous whisper. She looked at Lucas, sleeping peacefully on a pile of their few belongings, so much like the Daniel and Lena from the diary, and a fierce, protective anger ignited within her, burning away some of the cold fear. The Hartmans had no one to fight for them. They had vanished, erased by a man's avarice. But she was still here. The thought was terrifying but also clarifying. The money was a weapon. The diary was the truth. For a moment, a wild, dangerous idea began to form in her mind, to not just use the money to escape, but to somehow find justice for this ghostly family that now haunted her. Bang, bang, bang. The sound was so loud, so violent. It was like a physical blow. The heavy metal door of the basement shuddered in its frame. Helen screamed, a short, sharp cry of pure terror, scrambling backwards and pulling Lucas behind her. Her heart exploded in her chest, a frantic, wild bird beating against her ribs. Lucas woke with a startled cry, his eyes wide with fear in the dim light. The banging came again, harder this time, an aggressive, demanding summons that promised violence. It wasn't a knock, it was a command. Who could possibly be here? No one knew they existed, no one but the faceless entity on the shady website. 1,000 terrible possibilities flooded her mind. Was it the landlord? The police? Had they been discovered? The dripping water was the only other sound, a slow, steady counterpoint to the frantic hammering of her own heart. She pressed a finger to her lips, signaling for Lucas to be silent, her entire body trembling uncontrollably as she stared at the vibrating door. Slowly, with a groan of rusted metal, the door creaked open. A tall, impeccably dressed man stood silhouetted against the dim light of the alley. He was around 70, with a full head of silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from cold marble. He wore a dark, tailored suit that probably cost more than Helen had ever earned in a year, and his shoes were polished to a mirror shine, a shocking contrast to the filth and grime of the basement floor. He didn't step inside immediately, but surveyed the wretched space with a look of detached distaste, his gaze sweeping over the weeping walls, the puddle of water, and finally, settling on Helen and Lucas, huddled in the corner. His eyes were a pale, cold blue, like chips of ice, and they held no warmth, no sympathy. The air around him seemed to crackle with power and an ancient, reptilian stillness. He smelled faintly of expensive cologne and cold money, a scent that was an assault in the mold-scented air. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice smooth and cultured, but with an underlying edge of steel. It was the voice of a man accustomed to being obeyed, a voice that never had to be raised. He took a single, deliberate step inside, his expensive shoes making a soft sound on the cracked concrete. "I am Arthur Sterling. I own this building, or rather, I own most of it." The name hit Helen with the force of a physical punch. Sterling. It was him, the grandson, the heir to the poison. She felt the blood drain from her face, and a cold sweat broke out across her skin. He was real. The ghost story had a face, and it was standing right in front of her. She instinctively pulled the metal box further into the shadows behind her, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she was sure he could hear it. He knew. He had to know. The family legend. The lost fortune. He wasn't here by accident. He had come for his grandfather's stolen treasure, and she was standing in his way. This was the monster from the diary, made flesh. He gave her a thin, predatory smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. "I'll be direct," he continued, his gaze flicking from her to the squalid surroundings. "I was surprised to find this unit had been sold. It was an oversight by my property management company. This place is, as you can see, uninhabitable. It's a health hazard. I'm prepared to correct this error. I will give you $30,000, cash, 10 times what I'm told you paid. You can take your son and find a proper, safe place to live." The offer hung in the air, a temptation laced with poison. $30,000, it was a fortune. It would solve all her problems. But Helen knew what it was. It was a pittance. It was the price of her silence. He wasn't buying a basement. He was buying the box. He was trying to finish what his grandfather had started, to finally secure the blood money. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of fear and a strange, newfound resolve. She clutched the diary hidden beneath her sweater. She was the only person on earth who knew the truth. Her throat was dry, her voice a reedy whisper when she finally found it. "No," she managed to say, "thank you, but we're fine. This is our home now." She tried to sound firm, but her voice trembled uncontrollably. The lie was flimsy, absurd, and they both knew it. Sterling's thin smile vanished. His face became a cold, hard mask. The air in the room grew heavy, charged with menace. He took another step closer, looming over her. "I don't think you understand," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous purr. "This is a very old building, unstable. The wiring is ancient. Accidents happen, fires. It would be a terrible tragedy if something were to happen down here. Especially," he added, his icy gaze falling pointedly on Lucas, who whimpered and hid his face in Helen's side, "with a child living in such a dangerous, flammable place." The threat was no longer veiled. It was a gleaming knife pressed against her throat. He turned without another word and left, leaving the door ajar. The silence he left behind, more terrifying than his words. Helen was left shaking, clutching her son, the weight of the treasure and its terrible secret now a life-or-death burden. What would you do in her place? Would you take the money and run, saving your child but burying the truth forever? Or would you risk everything to fight a monster for a family you've never met? The silence Arthur Sterling left behind was a living entity, a suffocating presence that was far more terrifying than his threats. Helen remained frozen in the corner, her arms a vice around Lucas, who was trembling violently against her side. The alleyway light, slanting through the open door, seemed unnaturally bright, painting a long, accusing rectangle on the filthy floor. Every sound was magnified, amplified by her terror. The steady drip, drip, drip of water from the ceiling was no longer a simple annoyance. It was the ticking of a bomb. It was a countdown. Sterling's words echoed in the cavernous space of her mind. Accidents happen. Fires. She could almost smell it. A phantom scent of smoke and burning wires, could almost feel a phantom heat on her skin. The cold, damp air of the basement suddenly felt flammable, charged with a deadly potential. Her heart hammered against her ribs. A frantic prisoner trying to break free, each beat a shout of, "He knows, he knows, he knows." She was trapped. This small, wretched space was no longer a symbol of her failure. It was her tomb. It was the trap the Hartmans had been caught in, and now the jaws had snapped shut on her and her son. The cold stone walls seemed to be closing in, the low ceiling pressing down. Squeezing the air from her lungs, she stared at the open doorway, expecting Sterling's silhouette to reappear at any moment, this time without the pretense of a negotiation. She felt a wave of nausea, so profound she had to swallow hard against the bile rising in her throat. The $30,000 offer was a confession. It was proof that the diary was true, that the fortune was real, and that the Sterling family's legacy was built on a foundation of betrayal and murder. And she had refused it. She had looked the monster in the eye and said no. The foolhardy bravery of that act now curdled into pure, unadulterated fear. What had she been thinking? She had signed their death warrant for a family of ghosts. She clutched the heavy metal box, hidden in the shadows behind her. Its weight was immense, not just the physical weight of gold and diamonds, but the crushing burden of its history. This box was the reason Sterling was here. It was the object of a generational obsession, a dark inheritance he felt was his by right. And she, a widowed seamstress with nothing to her name, was the only thing standing in his way. The thought was ludicrous, insane. It was a fly trying to stop a freight train. Her body was racked with shivers, a deep, bone-rattling cold that had nothing to do with the dampness of the room. It was the chill of absolute powerlessness. She looked down at Lucas, his face buried in her sweater, his small body shaking. The fierce, protective anger she had felt earlier was consumed by a tidal wave of terror. She had not only failed to provide him a home, but she had led him into the crosshairs of a dangerous, ruthless man. The shame was a burning acid in her veins. A new clarity began to pierce through the fog of her panic. She could not stay here. Waiting was suicide. Sterling was not a man who made idle threats. The mention of a fire, the pointed look at Lucas, it was a promise. He would be back. Maybe in an hour, maybe in the dead of night, but he would return to claim his prize and erase the witnesses. Her mind, which had been a chaotic storm of fear, began to race, searching desperately for an escape route, a way out of this waking nightmare. The $30,000 was gone, the offer rescinded by her foolish refusal. She had nothing, $0 in her bank account, a son to protect, and a box of evidence that was both her only leverage and her greatest liability. She couldn't go to the police, not yet. Who would believe her? A destitute woman in a squalid basement with a fantastic story about a hidden treasure and a powerful real estate tycoon. They would think she was mad, or a thief herself. She needed more. She needed proof. She needed a witness. Her gaze drifted past the open door, up towards the shadowy structure of the rest of the building. Sterling had said he owned most of it. The word hung in her mind. Most, not all. That meant there were other people here, other residents, strangers. Could she risk it? Could she knock on a random door and beg for help from someone who might be on Sterling's payroll? Or who would simply slam the door in her face? The risks were enormous. But what was the alternative? To sit here and wait for the smell of gasoline? The risk of staying had suddenly become infinitely greater than the risk of reaching out. It was a terrifying gamble, another leap of faith into the unknown. But it was the only move she had left to play. She had to believe that not everyone in this dark, forgotten building was a servant of its greedy master. She had to believe that somewhere within these grimy walls there was a sliver of humanity, a single soul who might listen. A tiny, fragile seed of a plan began to form. With a resolve born of pure terror, she forced her trembling legs to move. "Come on, sweetie," she whispered to Lucas, her voice raspy and strained. "We have to go. We're going to visit a neighbor." Lucas looked up at her, his eyes wide and full of questions she couldn't answer. She pulled him to his feet, her movements jerky and frantic. She grabbed the rusty metal box, its weight a solid, terrifying reality in her arms. The leather-bound diary was tucked safely inside her sweater, its sharp corners digging into her skin, a constant reminder of the story she now carried. She peered out of the basement door. The narrow alleyway was empty, shrouded in the deepening shadows of the late afternoon. The sounds of the city seemed distant, muted, as if this forgotten corner of the world operated under its own set of rules, its own grim silence. She had to move now. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she took Lucas by the hand and stepped out of the tomb and into the belly of the beast. The air in the alley was cold and sharp, a welcome contrast to the thick, stagnant atmosphere of the basement. Above, a small patch of bruised purple sky was visible between the towering brick walls. A single door was visible on the ground floor, just a few feet from the basement entrance. A faint sliver of yellow light glowed from beneath it, a sign of life. As she crept closer, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, she heard a sound. It was a soft, rhythmic whirring, a mechanical hum that was instantly familiar. It was the sound of a sewing machine. The sound cut through her fear, a strange and comforting echo from her old life, from the days when her biggest worry was a difficult seam or a demanding client, a seamstress, a tailor, her fellow artisan working away in the gloom of this decaying building. A spark of connection, of kinship, ignited within her. This was more than a random door. It felt like a sign, a beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness. She stood before the door for a long moment, the heavy box clutched to her chest, her knuckles poised to knock. The rhythmic hum of the machine was steady, a calm and methodical pulse in the heart of the building's chaos. It was the sound of work, of purpose, of a life being lived despite the surrounding decay. It was everything she had lost. Could she trust this? Could she interrupt this stranger's peace with her own catastrophic story? The fear of rejection, of being turned away, was a cold hand gripping her heart. But then she pictured Sterling's icy blue eyes, heard his veiled threat about a fire, and felt the small, trembling hand of her son in hers. She had no choice. She had to take the chance. She raised her hand and knocked, a soft, tentative rap of knuckles against old peeling paint. The sound was swallowed by the alley, but inside, the whirring of the sewing machine stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. The door opened a few inches, held by a brass security chain. A single dark eye, surrounded by a constellation of deep wrinkles, peered out at her. Yes, the voice was a dry, reedy rasp, like the rustle of old paper. It held no menace, only a weary curiosity. I'm so sorry to bother you," Helen stammered, her words tumbling out in a rush. "My name is Helen. This is my son, Lucas. We just moved into the basement." The eye blinked slowly. Then the chain rattled, and the door swung open. The man who stood before her was impossibly old, a frail figure stooped with the weight of nearly a century. He was bald, with a fringe of wispy white hair, and his face was a roadmap of a long life. His skin thin and almost translucent over his sharp cheekbones. He wore a simple vest over a collarless shirt, and a pair of spectacles was perched on the end of his nose. He looked her up and down, his gaze taking in her disheveled appearance, her terrified eyes, and the rusty box in her arms. He stepped aside, gesturing with a frail, age-spotted hand for her to enter. "Come in, child. Come in out of the cold." His apartment was a single, cluttered room, but it was clean and warm. The air smelled of hot iron, chalk, and old wool, a scent so deeply familiar it brought tears to Helen's eyes. Bolts of fabric were stacked against one wall, and spools of thread of every color imaginable were arranged on wooden dowels. In the center of the room, under a bright lamp, sat an ancient black iron sewing machine. It was a tailor's workshop, a sanctuary of creation amidst the ruin. The old man shuffled over to a small stove and put a kettle on the burner. "My name is Abe," he said without turning around. "You look like you've seen a ghost." The simple act of kindness, the offer of warmth, was so unexpected it shattered the dam of her composure. A sob escaped her, and she sank into a wooden chair, the heavy box thudding onto the floor beside her. She started talking, the words pouring out of her in a frantic, disjointed torrent. She told him about her husband, the eviction, the desperate purchase of the basement. She told him about the crushing disappointment, the discovery of the loose floorboard and the box. She left out the specifics of the treasure, speaking of it only as old valuables. Her voice was a choked whisper, punctuated by sobs she couldn't control. Abe listened patiently, his back still to her as he prepared 2 cups of tea, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't interrupt. He simply let her pour out the poison of her fear and despair. Lucas, sensing the change in atmosphere, crept to her side and leaned against her leg, his eyes fixed on the kind old man. The warmth of the small room began to thaw the ice in Helen's veins, the simple presence of another human being a balm on her raw nerves. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she wasn't completely alone in her terror. Then, she got to the part that mattered most. She described the visit from the tall, cold man in the expensive suit. "His name was Sterling," she said, the name tasting like ash in her mouth. "Arthur Sterling. He threatened us. He threatened my son." She finally looked up, her eyes pleading with him to believe her. "He knows about the box. I think he knew it was here all along. There was a diary," she added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. She pulled it from her sweater, its worn leather cover seeming to absorb the light in the room. "It mentions a family, a German family who hid the box here, a long, long time ago. He wanted it." She took a shaky breath, summoning the last of her courage. The name in the diary, the family's name, was Hartmann. At the mention of that name, Abe, who had been about to place a cup of tea in front of her, froze. The cup rattled in its saucer, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Abe slowly turned to face her, his expression transformed. The gentle, weary kindness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. The deep-set wrinkles around his eyes seemed to deepen, his mouth a thin, tight line. "Hartman," he repeated, his voice a low, rough whisper. The name was not a question, but an echo from a place deep in his memory. He set the teacups down with a trembling hand and sank into the chair opposite her, his gaze locked on the diary in her lap. The room, which had felt like a warm sanctuary, was suddenly charged with the electricity of the past. The rhythmic hum of the city outside faded away, and Helen felt as if she and the old man were the only two people left in the world, suspended in a moment where the past and present had violently collided. He knew. The look on his face told her everything. He knew the name. The ghost story was no longer just hers, it was his too. He leaned forward, his ancient eyes boring into hers. "I was a boy," he began, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "Younger than your son there. I've lived in this building my whole life, 92 years. I remember them." He gestured vaguely towards the ceiling. They didn't live in the basement. No one ever lived in the basement. They rented a small room on the second floor. A man, a woman, and two small children, a boy and a girl. Helen's heart seized. Daniel and Lena. They were real. They weren't just names on a page, they were a memory in this old man's mind. She listened, transfixed, as Abe painted a picture of the shadowy family. They were quiet, frightened, like mice in the walls. You would see them in the hallway, just a flicker, and then they were gone. The mother had the saddest eyes I have ever seen. He paused, his gaze distant, lost in the mists of 80 years ago, and Helen felt a profound, chilling connection to the woman with the sad eyes. "They were only here for a few weeks," Abe continued, his voice barely audible. "And then one morning they were gone, just vanished. Their room was empty. People whispered. Some said they had run out of money and done a midnight flit. Others said the authorities had come for them in the night. They were illegal, you see. Refugees. Everyone was scared in those days. Scared of foreigners, scared of the war, scared of their own shadows. No one asked too many questions. It was safer not to." He looked at the diary in Helen's hands. "They disappeared, and no one ever spoke the name Hartman in this building again, until today." The finality in his tone sent a shiver down Helen's spine. She was not just uncovering a crime, she was excavating a mass grave of memory, disturbing a silence that had been kept for nearly a century out of fear and self-preservation. This building wasn't just old, it was haunted by the ghosts of its own indifference. "There was another man," Abe said, his voice dropping even lower, laced with a long dormant fear. "He was here all the time back then, not a resident, a visitor. An important man, always in a sharp suit and polished shoes. He never smiled. He had cold eyes like a shark." Helen stopped breathing. She knew who he was talking about. He owned the building, even then. He would walk the halls like he was inspecting his kingdom, and everyone would scurry out of his way. We were all afraid of him, even the adults. He had a power about him, a dangerous power. Abe leaned closer, his whisper raw and urgent. He was the one who rented the room to the Hartmans, and he was the one who was here the day after they disappeared, supervising the cleaning out of their room himself. His name, Abe said, spitting the word out like something foul, was Sterling, Arthur Sterling's grandfather. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with a horrifying, resounding clang. The crime, the victims, the motive, the perpetrator, it was all connected. The truth settled in the room. A tangible kind of suffocating weight. The chain of events was clear and unbroken. A direct line of predatory greed passed down from grandfather to grandson. Sterling's grandfather had lured the Hartmans to a building he owned, stolen their fortune, and then had them removed, likely by reporting them to the very authorities they were hiding from. He had hidden the treasure in the basement, a place he controlled, a place no one would ever think to live in or look, planning to retrieve his blood money later. Now his grandson had come to finish the job. The sheer, calculated evil of it all was staggering. It was a perfect crime, buried for 80 years, and it would have remained buried forever if not for a desperate mother and her son's toy car. Helen felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the floor had dropped out from under her, the weight of this knowledge too immense to bear. She was no longer just a witness, she was the sole keeper of a legacy of murder. Suddenly, a screech of tires from the alley outside shattered the heavy silence. It was a violent, aggressive sound that made both Helen and Abe jump. It was followed by the slam of car doors and the crunch of heavy footsteps on gravel. It was too soon. He was back already. Abe, moving with a speed that belied his age, hobbled to the window and peered through a crack in the dusty blinds. His body went rigid. "It's him," he hissed, his voice tight with alarm. "Sterling, and he's not alone. He has two large men with him." Helen's blood ran cold. Her worst fear was realized, and it was happening now. She scrambled to the window, crouching beside Abe, and looked out. There, illuminated by the harsh glare of the car's headlights, stood Arthur Sterling, a dark silhouette pointing towards the basement door. He was directing the two thugs, who were built like refrigerators, their brutish forms radiating brute force and menace. He was done with offers. He was done with threats. He had come to take what he wanted. A deafening crash echoed from the alley as one of the thugs kicked the basement door clean off its rusted hinges. The sound of splintering wood and tortured metal ripped through the night. Helen flinched as if she had been struck, a strangled cry catching in her throat. She could hear them inside her new home, their heavy boots stomping on the floorboards. The sounds of destruction began immediately, the crash of her few boxes being thrown against the walls, the thud of her sewing machine being overturned, the angry, guttural shouts of men searching for something. They were tearing her life apart, piece by piece, looking for the box that was sitting right here on the floor of Abe's apartment. She was paralyzed, her mind blank with a terror so absolute it felt like a physical blow. They would search the basement, find nothing, and then where would they look next? The only other occupied unit on this floor. This door. Abe turned from the window, his ancient face a mask of grim determination. The fear was there in the slight tremor of his hands, but it was overshadowed by a fierce, protective resolve. "There is no time," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. He grabbed Helen's arm, his grip surprisingly firm, pulling her away from the window. "They will search that basement, and when they find nothing, they will come here. We have maybe 2 minutes." Panic, cold and sharp, seized Helen. "Where can we go? The alley is blocked. They'll see us." Abe shook his head, his eyes burning with intensity. "Not the front, the back. Your basement. There is a small window in the rear wall, isn't there?" Helen's mind raced. Yes, a small, grimy window high up on the wall, caked with decades of filth. She had dismissed it as being too small, too high. "It leads to the old courtyard," Abe pressed on. "It's your only way out. You must go, now." He laid out the plan with a speed and clarity that defied his age. "I will go into the hallway," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "I will make a noise. I will shout. I'll tell them I'm calling the police. I will draw them out of the basement and keep them occupied. It will only buy you a moment. You must take that moment. You take the boy in the box and you go out that window. Don't stop. Don't look back. Run." The thought of him, a frail 92-year-old man, confronting 2 violent thugs and a ruthless killer was horrifying. "No," Helen whispered. "You can't. They'll hurt you." Abe gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "Child, I am 92 years old. What can they do to me that time hasn't already? This is not about me, it's about that diary. It's about that family, it's about justice. 80 years too late. Now, are you going to let those ghosts down, or are you going to run?" His words were a slap, a bucket of ice water that shocked her out of her panicked paralysis. He was right. This was it. The turning point. The moment of truth. All the fear, all the despair had led to this single, critical choice: to flee and fight, or to be caught and silenced forever. The ghosts of the Hartman family seemed to swirl around her, their silent screams urging her on. She looked at Lucas, his face pale with terror, and she knew she couldn't fail him. She couldn't fail them. She nodded, a sharp jerk of her head. "Okay," she said, her voice shaking but firm. She scooped the heavy metal box into her arms, the cold metal a shocking reminder of the stakes. Abe gave her a final, quick nod. "My daughter," he said, his voice urgent. "Her name is Sarah. She's a lawyer. I will write down her address. Go there. Show her the diary. Tell her everything. She will know what to do." He scribbled an address on a scrap of paper from his pocket and pressed it into her hand. The paper felt like a lifeline. With no more words, Abe turned and walked to his door. He took a deep breath. And then, with a strength she couldn't have imagined, he threw the door open and stepped into the hallway, shouting, "Hey, what is going on out there? I'm calling the police. Get out of this building." His reedy voice echoed down the corridor, a frail man's defiant roar against the darkness. Just as he predicted, the sounds of destruction from the basement stopped. She heard the heavy tread of the thugs, boots, as they came out to confront the source of the noise. This was it. Their chance? Now, she hissed to Lucas, we have to go, run. She grabbed his hand and pulled him out of Abe's apartment, back towards the gaping dark maw of her ransacked basement. The smell of dust and violence hung in the air. She didn't dare look back to see what was happening to Abe. She could only pray and run. The basement was a scene of total devastation. Her meager belongings were shattered and strewn across the floor. The single light bulb had been smashed, plunging the room into near-total darkness. Illuminated only by the faint moonlight filtering through the tiny rear window, the air was thick with the dust of their destruction. "The window, Lucas, climb!" she urged, her voice a frantic whisper. She shoved a broken crate against the rear wall, creating a makeshift step. Lucas scrambled onto it, his small hands finding purchase on the grimy sill. He was small enough to fit. He squeezed his body through the narrow opening, his feet dangling for a second before he dropped with a soft thud into the darkness of the courtyard outside. "The box!" Helen gasped, shoving the heavy metal container through the window after him. He caught it, stumbling under its weight. Now it was her turn. She was bigger. The opening was impossibly small. For a terrifying second, she thought she was stuck. She squeezed her shoulders through, the rough stone scraping her skin raw, her clothes tearing. She could hear the thugs shouting in the hallway, their voices getting closer. They were coming back. She pushed harder, ignoring the pain, fueled by pure adrenaline. Her hips caught. She twisted, wriggled, and then suddenly, she was through, tumbling out of the window and landing in a heap on the damp, cracked paving stones of the courtyard. She didn't pause to catch her breath. She grabbed Lucas's hand, took the box from him, and they ran. The courtyard was a maze of overflowing dumpsters and discarded furniture, a graveyard of forgotten things. They scrambled over piles of trash, their feet slipping on unseen filth. They could hear shouting from the front of the building, Abe's defiant voice mixed with the angry roars of the thugs. He had bought them the time they needed. They found a rusted gate at the far end of the courtyard, its hinges groaning in protest as Helen forced it open. They slipped through the narrow gap and found themselves in another dark, anonymous alley. They didn't stop. They ran, blindly, into the labyrinth of the city at night. The sounds of their frantic footsteps and ragged breaths were the only things they could hear. The weight of the box was immense, banging against her leg with every stride, but she didn't care. It was their only weapon, their only hope. The scrap of paper with Sarah's address was clenched tightly in her fist, a fragile promise of sanctuary. They were running from a monster, but for the first time, they were not running away from the fight. They were running towards it. The cries of despair in the dark basement had finally been replaced by the thunderous, desperate heartbeat of a fight for survival and a cry for a justice 80 years overdue. The door to the address Abe had given her opened into another world. It was a bright, warm apartment that smelled of books and brewing coffee. A woman with her father's intense eyes and a lawyer's sharp, assessing gaze stood before them. This was Sarah. She took one look at Helen's torn clothes, the raw scratches on her arms, Lucas's pale, terrified face, and the rusty box clutched in Helen's hands, and ushered them inside without a word. The space was an oasis of calm and order, the antithesis of the chaos they had just fled. Bookshelves lined the walls, and legal pads were stacked neatly on a large wooden desk. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Helen felt a fragile sliver of safety. She placed the box on the polished floor, the sound of metal on wood, a dull, heavy thud. Sarah wrapped a blanket around Lucas, her movements calm and reassuring. Then she turned to Helen, her expression a mixture of deep concern and focused resolve. "Tell me," Sarah said, her voice steady and strong. "Tell me everything, from the beginning." As Helen spoke, the story poured out of her, no longer a frantic torrent of fear, but a coherent, chilling narrative. With every word, Sarah's expression hardened, her initial concern solidifying into cold, professional anger. She listened, her gaze fixed on Helen, occasionally jotting down notes on a legal pad, her pen scratching furiously against the paper. When Helen finally finished, gesturing to the diary and the box, a heavy silence filled the room. Sarah walked over, and knelt beside the box, lifting the lid. She stared at the glittering hoard of jewels and the yellowed letters, not with greed, but with a profound and sorrowful reverence. She gently picked up the leather-bound diary, holding it as if it were a sacred artifact. "My father remembers them," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "He spoke of the sad-eyed Germans his whole life." She looked up at Helen, her eyes blazing with a righteous fire. "They preyed on the helpless, and now the grandson is doing it again. Well, not anymore, not on my watch." Sarah moved with the swift, decisive energy of a predator. The next hour was a blur of phone calls, her voice a low, commanding force that cut through the night. She didn't call a local precinct. She called the personal number of an assistant district attorney she knew, waking him up. She followed that with a call to a contact at the FBI's Art Crime Team, an office that specialized in stolen historical artifacts and restitution cases. To each, she laid out the story with breathtaking precision and legal clarity. She spoke of the diary as primary evidence of a historical crime, of the jewels as stolen assets, of Abe's living testimony as the irrefutable link between the past and present, and of Arthur Sterling's actions, the extortion, the threats, the violent break-in, as a modern-day continuation of that crime. She wasn't just reporting a threat, she was presenting a meticulously constructed case, complete with a victim, a witness, physical evidence, and a high-profile villain. The wheels of justice began to turn. Within 2 hours, 2 calm, serious-looking FBI agents and a detective from the DA's office were sitting in Sarah's living room. They treated Helen with a quiet respect that was utterly disarming. They called her Mom, offered her coffee, and spoke to Lucas with gentle reassurance. They listened to her story again, this time recording it officially, their questions sharp and specific. The lead agent, a woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, carefully examined the diary and the letters, her gloved fingers handling the fragile pages with extreme care. The contents of the box were photographed and catalogued on the living room floor, each piece of jewelry sealed in an individual evidence bag. A profound sense of relief washed over Helen as she watched them work. The terrible, crushing weight of the secret, the burden she had carried alone in the dark, was finally being lifted from her shoulders and transferred to the broad, capable machinery of the law. She wasn't alone anymore. The arrest of Arthur Sterling was not a back-alley affair. It happened the next day, in the full light of the morning. Federal agents and city detectives walked into the gleaming glass and steel lobby of Sterling Tower, their presence a quiet, disruptive force in the Cathedral of Commerce. They didn't storm his penthouse office. They were buzzed up by his secretary, news cameras, tipped off by an anonymous source, captured the moment Arthur Sterling, dressed in a flawless bespoke suit, was escorted out in handcuffs. His face, usually a mask of cold, unassailable power, was a mixture of disbelief and incandescent rage. The image was on every news channel within the hour. In the safety of Sarah's apartment, Abe watched the broadcast, his frail body perched on the edge of the sofa. As the police car carrying his family's old tormentor pulled away, the old tailor did not smile. He simply closed his eyes, and a single tear of vindication, 80 years in the making, traced a slow path through the deep wrinkles on his cheek. The case became a sensation, a dark, gripping story that captivated the city. The investigation into Sterling unearthed a generational legacy of corruption and predatory practices, his grandfather's crime being only the most horrific example. The contents of Samuel Hartman's diary were translated, authenticated, and released to the public. For the first time, the Hartman family's story was told. Their names, Samuel, Rebecca, Daniel, and Lena, were spoken aloud in newspapers and on television. They were no longer forgotten ghosts in a dusty basement. They became symbols of a historical injustice finally brought to light, their tragedy a stark reminder of the city's forgotten victims. Sterling's empire began to crumble as his partners and investors distanced themselves from the scandal. The trial was swift. Faced with the diary, Abe's unshakable testimony, and the thugs who turned on him for a lighter sentence, Arthur Sterling was convicted of extortion, conspiracy, and a dozen other charges. His name was finally cursed, just as Samuel had prayed. The question of the treasure, however, remained. It was a fortune worth millions, a collection of priceless jewels and historical currency. Sarah, acting as Helen's pro bono counsel, worked tirelessly alongside the district attorney's office and international historical societies to find any living heirs to the Hartman family. They searched archives in Germany, Israel, and the United States. They traced passenger manifests and deportation records, but the trail went cold in the ashes of the Holocaust. The official conclusion was that the entire Hartman family line had been extinguished, their last members perishing in a concentration camp shortly after being deported from the United States. The fortune was officially declared ownerless, a tragic monument to a family that had been erased from the world. The jewels sat in a government vault, their fate to be decided by a probate court, a final, poignant chapter in the long and sorrowful saga. The treasure had no home. In a quiet courtroom months later, a judge delivered the final verdict. Sarah argued that Helen was not just a finder, she was the catalyst for justice. Her desperate act of buying the property, her courage in the face of Sterling's threats, and her determination to see the story through had been instrumental in righting a historical wrong. The property had been purchased legally, the contents found upon it, with no living heirs to claim the fortune. The law was clear. If Complex of the judge, his voice echoing in the silent room, ruled that the entire fortune, the jewels and the cash, legally belonged to Helen. The sound of the gavel striking the wood was not loud, but for Helen, it was a thunderclap that split her life in two, the life before Chun and the life after. She sat stunned, unable to process the words. Sarah squeezed her hand, her eyes shining with tears. It was over. The ghost story had ended, and a new story, one Helen could write herself, was about to begin. A year later, the only dripping sound Helen heard was from a small stone fountain in the center of her own sunny garden. The air smelled of roses and freshly cut grass, not mold and decay. Lucas, now 11 and his face full of life and laughter, chased a monarch butterfly across the lawn, his shouts of joy a beautiful music that had replaced the tomb-like silence of the basement. Helen sat at a patio table, a sketchbook open in front of her, designing a dress not for a meager fee, but for the sheer joy of creation. She had used a portion of the fortune to buy this safe, beautiful house and secure Lucas's future forever. With the rest, guided by Sarah and Abe, she had established the Hartman Foundation, a small but powerful organization dedicated to providing legal aid and housing assistance to refugee families arriving in the city, ensuring that no one else would have to face the darkness the Hartmans had. The heavy weight of the treasure had been transformed into a legacy of hope, honoring the family she'd never met. The memory of the cold, slimy walls and the crushing despair was a distant scar, a reminder not of failure, but of resilience. The ghosts of the basement had been laid to rest, their story told, their names honored. Helen looked at her son, his future bright and limitless, and tears welled in her eyes. But these were not the hot tears of failure or the sorrowful tears for a lost family. They were quiet tears of profound gratitude for a second chance, for a toy car that rolled into a corner, and for the courageous old tailor who refused to let the past remain buried. She had found more than a fortune under that rotten floorboard. She had found her own strength and a purpose far greater than she could have ever imagined. The story of the Hartman family and her part in it serves as a powerful reminder that sometimes the darkest places can hide the most incredible hope, and that one small voice can be enough to break an 80-year silence. If their story of justice and redemption moved you, subscribe to our channel for more tales of when the darkness gives way to light.